Everyone. All right, so here we are. This is the lecture for Monday, March 23rd, and we are picking up with Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. I hope you're all doing okay. I hope you're all isolated and taking care of yourselves, staying sane, taking care of the older people in your lives. It's just going to keep getting crazier. But we're going to keep going, talking about philosophy and Descartes. You have paper due today, Monday, 23rd, at midnight. Do your best to get it in. If it's a little late, if it's going to be a little late, drop me a line, write me an email, let me know what's going on. Don't drive yourselves crazy about grades or papers or anything else right now. Yeah. So, we left off really at the beginning of the second meditation. We had just discussed Descartes' most famous phrase, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And we discussed what that really means, and I put that question on the Blackboard discussion page also. So this is something you should be able to explain, is what does Descartes mean by I think, therefore I am? And I think, therefore I am is the answer to the problem, the question, does anything exist? Right? I think, therefore I am is that Archimedean point that Descartes discovers in his project of radical doubt. Right? Descartes has been doubting everything that can be doubted. Right? Remember, he says, I will treat anything that has deceived me once as though it is deceiving me every time. So, the senses have deceived him in the past, right? There's reason to question the information we get from our senses because we are sometimes led astray by our senses, and therefore Descartes is going to question all knowledge that comes through the senses, which means he doubts the existence of the entire physical world, including his own body. And he doubts that even his own body exists because, right, every piece of knowledge we have about our own body is sensory knowledge. And if I can be deceived from my senses, I have to throw all that that sense data, that sensory knowledge out the window. So Descartes is not convinced that anything in the physical world exists, and then he gives us three different arguments for doubting everything beyond the physical world, including the truths of mathematics and any other kind of idea or truth or knowledge. So those three arguments, right, are the argument from dreaming. Right, I often in dreams believe that I am someplace that in fact I'm not. In reality, I'm in bed. So it could be possible that even my experience, my thinking, my responses to the world, everything about my existence, everything in reality is an illusion in the same way that a dream is an illusion. How do I know that this embodied experience, this embodied life that I live is not just a dream. But Descartes says, right, even in dreams, there are certain things that are immutable and certain. For example, the truths of mathematics. It's impossible in any dream for a triangle to have more than three sides, or for 1 plus 1 not to equal 2. So, what do we make of this? Right, the other argument is the argument from madness. Maybe I'm a mad person. Maybe I'm insane. And that's very much in line with the argument from dreaming. And in fact, that comes first. So it's the argument from madness, the argument from dreaming, and then the ultimate knockdown argument for the project of radical doubt is the argument about the evil deceiver. Right? So it's conceivable that, in fact, not just my sensory experience, but all of my thoughts, everything that I've ever imagined or known or experienced in any kind of way, has no bearing on reality itself, but is the product of some evil deceiver, an all-powerful evil God that would deceive me about everything. This is basically the way that this is often described these days is in terms of the matrix argument, right? That you would be a kind of brain in a vat hooked up to some kind of supercomputer that would give your brain all of this input that would make it feel as though it had a body, that it was part of a physical world. But all of that would be illusory, would be false. You're actually just a brain in a vat. So how do we get out of this situation? So the problem of the argument for doubt from the evil deceiver is the one that throws Descartes into that nihilistic experience where he's disoriented, he doesn't know what's up and what's down, and he asks, right, maybe the only thing that is true is that nothing is true. Descartes bumps up against this extreme nihilism after going through the thought experiment with the evil deceiver. And what he arrives at the beginning of the second meditation is something that cannot be doubted, right? Which is his own existence. Even if there's an evil deceiver who's deceiving about everything, it's nevertheless true that he is something, that he exists because he is being deceived. He could be deceived about the fact that he's having a body, that he has a body. He could be deceived about everything, but he can't be deceived that he is a thinking thing that has been deceived or is being deceived. And so the reason why it's I think, therefore I am, is because thinking is the only thing that he knows he's doing, right? Which is, right, thought is involved in being deceived and in doubting. So the fact, as long as he's able to doubt, he is thinking and therefore exists. So he comes to this conclusion on page 82, which I mentioned at the very end of the last lecture, right? So I am, I exist, that is certain, right? But for how long? For as long as I am thinking. My existence is only certain when I'm involved in the act of thinking. And he goes on, I am then in the strict sense only a thing that thinks. That is, I am a mind or intelligence or intellect or reason. So what Descartes is still very much in question and unsure. He knows that he is a thinking thing. He goes on 82, sort of just a little below the middle. I know that I exist. The question is, what is this I that I know?
If the I is understood strictly as we have been taking it, then it is quite certain that knowledge of it does not depend on things of whose existence I am as yet unaware. So, this I that I've encountered, which is nothing more than a thinking thing at this point, uh, can be known. And as he says, knowledge of it does not depend on things whose existence I am yet unaware of. Uh, Everything he needs to know about himself is already present in himself, right? Now, what he wants to find out is what is the true nature of this thinking I. Uh, and what he's asking here is an interesting question, right? He's not asking, uh, you know, in like a kind of Jackie Chan way, like, who am I? Right? What is my personal identity? Um, or like, what is my place in the world? He's not even asking, right, what's the relationship of my mind to my body, because he hasn't posited that he has a body. He can't be certain that he has a body. So what he's asking about is simply, what is the nature of thinking? Uh, and there are a lot of sort of a lot of critiques of Descartes and the cogito. Right? I think, therefore I am. Well, how does he get this I in the first place? And what is he really investigating when he asks about the nature of the thinking thing? Uh, right, one line of critique would go, um, well, what you have encountered in the fact that in doubting there is existence is not anything that as yet can really be called an I. Uh, all that has been shown is that there is thinking. Why Descartes attaches a personal identity, an I, to this thinking is a little bit questionable. Um, what Descartes experiences is that thinking exists. And so there's some question, I think, as to whether or not Descartes knows this. A lot of these meditations um, are written in a way uh, to make them a little bit less extreme, a little bit more accessible to the general reader. Uh, and one example of this might be uh, in the fact that Descartes posits an individual thinker rather than just thinking itself. So we might critique Descartes here and say, all you've shown is that thinking exists, not that anything like an I exists. And we could then ask, well, what is thinking if not the thinking of an individual? Can there be thinking without a thinker? Um, and we might push back on that and say, well, that's actually what Descartes is asking, but he's putting it in the context of a thinker, of an individual, of an I, of himself as an individual thinker in order to make this more accessible. But in any case, one of the interesting questions this raises is, well, what is the nature of thinking? And what's the relationship between the thinker and thinking, between an individual and thinking? What is the experience of having a thought? What's the relationship between you as an identity and a thought that enters your mind? You could ask, right, can you ever decide to have a thought? Uh, do you ever make a choice, for example, to have an idea? Uh, and it seems as though the answer may be no, right? That an idea comes to you, that thinking is something that you, in some sense, um, that happens to you. So you can sit back and say,
I'm going to brainstorm, or I'm going to try to have an idea. I'm going to create conditions under which an idea might present itself. But even under those conditions, even after having decided to have an idea, there's no guarantee that an idea is going to come to you. Right? If you could decide to have an idea, if you could decide to think something, then there would be no more problems or puzzles in the world, right? We would just decide to have ideas to solve those problems. So, right, there's some reason to doubt that the thinker and thinking are synonymous. That it may, in fact, in some way be possible to separate some kind of abstract thinking from any individual thinker. We see this in Plotinus also. This is sort of what Plotinus is getting at, that there is some kind of universal thinking that is not particular to any individual human being, but which every individual human being is able to tap into in some sense. Right, a kind of collective mind, which we tap into, but which doesn't belong to us as individuals. So we might say that Descartes has hit upon thinking itself rather than himself as a thinker. But right, this is essentially the question he's asking: what is this I? What is this thinking? And on 83, he goes into this a little bit more. He asks, but what then am I? A thing that thinks. What is that? A thing that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, is willing, is unwilling, and also imagines and has sensory perceptions. So what Descartes is doing here is describing what thinking is. He's describing different kinds of thinking, things that only exist in thinking. Right? So doubting and understanding, these are a kind of pair, right? We have a series of pairs here. Doubting and understanding are, we might say, because they're given priority here, the first forms of intellectual activity. Right? We understand and we doubt. That is the purest kind of thinking. And then after this, we have affirmation and denial. We affirm and deny. And this is going to be certainly attached to doubting and understanding. Doubting is a kind of denial. Understanding is a kind of affirmation. But we're inching closer to something that is not pure thinking, right? Because affirmation and denial are closer to judgments rather than pure thought. And as we're going to see, judgment is something that is synthetic, is about the external world, not just about the mind. Right? We'll talk a little bit more about that when we come to judgment in a second. But just remember, affirmation, denial, that these are terms of judgment, and Descartes is counting those as thinking. This is going to be a kind of way for him eventually to link this pure thinking with the physical world. Similarly, the next pair, we have willing and unwilling. And this is an interesting example here, because Descartes is suggesting that the will is something that is primarily intellectual, that in willing or being unwilling, we are, that is primarily an act of mind. And so we'll hold off on that also till when we get to what the will is for Descartes. He's kind of setting up the rest of the next two meditations, meditation 3 and 4, with this list of acts of thinking. But I think it's, again, interesting, similarly to judgment, to ask, well, what is the will, properly speaking? Where is the seat of the will. And we can think back to Plotinus here a little bit. Where's the soul? Where does the soul reside? We could also ask, where does the will reside? When you will yourself to do something, is that really an intellectual act, pure and simple? Right? When you're lying in bed in the morning and you know you have to get up in order to go to work or to go to school, you can tell yourself over and over again for a whole hour, right? You have to go out of bed. You have to go do this. You know, I know you don't want to, but you have to do this. That's your mind thinking, telling yourself to do something. Uh, Thinking, I need to get out of bed, is not synonymous with, doesn't happen simultaneously with the will to get out of bed. So you think, you churn your wheels, and then it seems to me, anyway, that the actual moment of willing yourself to do it is a somewhat different faculty than just thinking. Because you can think, I have to do this, I have to do this over and over again, an infinite number of times. But then there's a slight gap between thinking I have to do this and actually summoning the will to do it. Right? The same thing is true. I mean, so I've given a kind of depressing example, right? The inability to get out of bed. But, you know, you can think of this in terms of summoning the courage to do something also, right? To ask someone on a date or break up with someone or, you know, speak your mind in in class or in a company meeting or anything like that, right? There's a disconnect to some extent between the intellectual act of telling yourself that you should do something and then the actual ability to will yourself to actually act in the physical world. So it's interesting that Descartes is saying that willing and unwilling are also acts of thinking, mental acts, rather than physical acts or some kind of holistic act that would require a unity of body and mind. So Descartes is suggesting at least that the root of willing, like the root of judgment, lies in the mind and is mental. And then finally, taking a step even further into the physical realm, out of what would seem to be the purely mental realm, Descartes says, a thing that thinks is something that imagines and has sensory perception. Now, this is a big leap, even bigger than the previous two. In order to have sensory perceptions, it seems you would have to have a sensory perception of something outside of yourself, of the physical world. So Descartes is saying, and the same is true for imagination, and we'll talk a little bit about imagination, I hope, later also. Imagination is always is always built out of sensory data. I imagine a unicorn, but while that doesn't exist in the physical world, it's constructed out of images I get from the physical world. Right? It's just a horse with a horn on it. Right? So, with the imagination and sensory perception, Descartes is suggesting that a purely thinking thing has these faculties, imagination and sensory perception, which can only be used in conjunction with an external world, with a physical world. So I'm trying to be a little bit skeptical of this list of things that Descartes attributes to a thinking thing and to thought itself, because by attributing all these things to thought, he is sort of paving the way that we're going to then follow him on to making a connection between thinking and the physical world. So we should, I think, be a little skeptical of this. But it's also interesting, right? I mean, to what extent is it maybe true that the will, sensory perception, and judgment are primarily mental activities? And to say that those are primarily mental activities is to suggest that